In the entire history of human warfare, no weapon has ever matched the terrible power of the atomic bomb. 2 cities, 2 blinding flashes, 2 moments when the world changed forever. Over 200,000 souls vanished in those twin infernos, but one man walked through both fires and lived. His name was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. On August 6, 1945, he was incinerated in Hiroshima, burned, deafened, left for dead in a city of ash. 3 days later, on August 9th, he stood in an office in Nagasaki, trying to explain the impossible horror he had witnessed. His colleagues laughed nervously. One bomb couldn't destroy an entire city, they said. And then, the windows filled with light. The second bomb had found him. Lightning doesn't strike twice, they say, but for Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the sun fell from the sky. Twice. This is not a story about luck. This is not a story about coincidence. This is the story of a man who saw the end of the world twice and refused to let humanity forget. A man who carried the scars of 2 atomic bombs on his body and the weight of 200,000 lost souls in his heart. A man who could have chosen silence, but instead chose to speak. This is the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man who survived both atomic bombs, the witness who lived to warn the world. Before he became the most improbable survivor in history, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was simply ordinary. Born on March 16, 1916. In Nagasaki, he grew up in the shadow of Mount Inasa, where the harbor sparkled like polished silver and fishing boats dotted the bay like painted birds. Nagasaki was different from other Japanese cities. For centuries, it had been Japan's window to the Western world, the only port where foreign ships were allowed to trade during Japan's period of isolation. Portuguese missionaries had walked these streets. Dutch traders had lived here. The city had absorbed cultures from across the globe. Churches stood alongside Buddhist temples. Western-style houses sat next to traditional wooden homes. It was a city of bridges, both literal and cultural, and young Tsutomu loved it. His childhood was filled with the smell of the sea, the sound of temple bells echoing through the valleys, and the steady rhythm of a nation finding its place in a rapidly changing world. His father was a samurai descendant who had become a postal worker in the new modern Japan, a man who taught his son the value of duty, precision, and quiet dignity. His mother was gentle, traditional, a woman who sang folk songs while preparing meals and told stories of their ancestors. Yamaguchi was the youngest of 3 children, a quiet boy, studious, always building things with his hands. While other children played in the streets, he would sit by the harbor, sketching ships, trying to understand how they floated, how they moved, how human ingenuity could conquer the sea. His father wanted him to be a fisherman, to follow the old ways. But young Tsutomu dreamed of ships, not the wooden boats that his ancestors had sailed for centuries, but massive steel vessels that could cross oceans and carry entire nations on their backs. So he studied. He worked. He earned his way into technical school, one of the few boys from his neighborhood to do so. He excelled in mathematics and engineering. His teachers noticed his meticulous attention to detail, the way he would double-check every calculation, verify every measurement. "Yamaguchi," one professor told him, "you have the mind of an engineer. You see not just what is, but what could be." By his 20s, he had earned a position at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, one of Japan's most powerful corporations, a company that built everything from automobiles to aircraft carriers. He was assigned to the shipbuilding division, designing oil tankers for the Imperial Navy. It was prestigious work, stable, respectable. He was good at his job, precise, reliable, a man who measured twice and cut once. In 1940, at the age of 24, he married Hisako, a kind woman from a nearby village, with gentle eyes, a quiet strength, and a laugh that made him forget the long hours at the shipyard. Their courtship had been traditional, arranged by their families, but they found genuine affection in each other. Hisako was everything Yamaguchi was not: warm where he was reserved, spontaneous where he was careful, light where he was serious. She balanced him. They built a small life together in a wooden house near the harbor. Paper lanterns hung in the windows. A small garden where Hisako grew vegetables, chrysanthemums and cherry blossoms. Inside, the house smelled of miso soup, fresh tatami mats and incense. It was modest, but it was theirs. In the evenings, Yamaguchi would sit by the window, watching the fishing boats return to harbor, while Hisako prepared dinner and hummed old folk songs. These were simple moments, ordinary moments, the kind of moments that define a life. On October 12, 1944, their son was born, a healthy boy with his father's serious eyes and his mother's warmth. Yamaguchi held his son for the first time and felt something shift inside him, a fierce, overwhelming love that made his hands shake. He named him Katsutoshi. It meant victorious and wise. He prayed his son would grow up in a world without war. But by then, the war had already swallowed Japan whole. American bombers darkened the skies almost nightly. Cities burned from Okinawa to Tokyo. Food grew scarce. Rations were cut again and again. The government issued propaganda urging citizens to fight to the last man. Woman and child rather than surrender. Young men, boys, really, were being trained as kamikaze pilots, taught to view their deaths as the highest honor. The nation that had seemed invincible just a few years earlier was now fighting for its very survival, and in the secret laboratories of the United States, in a desert in New Mexico, scientists were building something the world had never seen. Weapon that could split the atom itself. Weapon that could harness the power of the sun. Weapon that would soon find Tsutomu Yamaguchi twice. By the summer of 1945, Japan was losing the war, and everyone knew it. American forces had captured island after island across the Pacific: Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Saipan. The Battle of Okinawa alone had killed over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians. Tokyo had been firebombed in March, killing over 100,000 people in a single night. 67 other Japanese cities had been bombed to rubble. The Imperial Navy was destroyed. The Air Force was down to its last planes, but still, the Japanese government refused to surrender. The military leadership spoke of fighting on the beaches, in the mountains, in the streets, a final defense that would cost millions of lives on both sides. And in this atmosphere of desperate, doomed determination, Tsutomu Yamaguchi received orders from Mitsubishi. In June of 1945, he was to travel to Hiroshima, a city 200 miles northeast of his home, for a special 3-month assignment. The company needed him to help design a new class of oil tankers at their Hiroshima shipyard. Ships that would support what remained of Japan's war effort. Yamaguchi didn't want to go. His son was barely 8 months old, just learning to crawl. Reaching for his father with chubby hands, Hisako needed him at home. Food was scarce, and she struggled to find enough to eat while nursing their baby. But duty was duty. In wartime Japan, you didn't refuse orders. To refuse would bring shame not just to yourself, but to your entire family. So in early June, he packed a small suitcase with a few changes of clothes, his drafting tools, and a photograph of Hisako holding baby Katsutoshi. The night before he left, Hisako prepared his favorite meal, grilled mackerel with rice and pickled vegetables. Though the portions were small, they sat together on the floor, eating in silence, both trying not to think about the separation ahead. After dinner, Yamaguchi held his son, memorizing the weight of him, the smell of his hair, the way he giggled when his father tickled his feet. "Take care of your mother," he whispered to the baby, who didn't understand but smiled anyway. The next morning, he kissed his wife and son goodbye and boarded the train to Hiroshima. Hisako stood on the platform, holding Katsutoshi, waving until the train disappeared around the bend. She felt a strange heaviness in her chest, a premonition she couldn't name, but she pushed it away and walked home. Through the morning mist, the journey to Hiroshima took most of the day. The train rattled through green mountains and rice fields, past villages untouched by war and cities scarred by American bombs. Yamaguchi sat by the window, watching Japan roll past, a country he loved but barely recognized anymore. When he arrived in Hiroshima in the late afternoon, he was struck by how peaceful it seemed. Unlike Tokyo and most other major cities, Hiroshima had been largely spared from the firebombing campaigns. There were theories why. Some said the Americans were saving it for something special. Others believed it simply wasn't strategically important enough. The truth was more complex. American military planners had indeed been saving Hiroshima, along with several other cities, as potential targets for a new weapon they were developing. But Yamaguchi didn't know this. All he saw was a beautiful city, relatively untouched by war. Hiroshima sat in a river delta, surrounded by gentle hills, with 7 rivers flowing through its heart like arteries carrying life. The population had swelled to over 350,000, a mix of civilians, soldiers stationed at the military headquarters, factory workers, and students. Streetcars rattled through the streets. Children played in the parks. Women hung laundry in the morning sun. There were food shortages, yes, and rationing, and the constant anxiety of war. But life continued. Yamaguchi found lodging in a small boarding house near the Mitsubishi shipyard in the southern part of the city. The landlady was an elderly woman named Mrs. Tanaka, whose husband had died in the war. She rented rooms to workers and treated them like the sons she'd lost. His room was on the 2nd floor, simple and spare. A futon that he rolled out each night. A low table for eating and working. A small window overlooking the Ota River, where he could watch the water flow past. It wasn't home, but it would do. Every morning, he woke before dawn and walked to the shipyard. The walk took 30 minutes through quiet streets, past shops just opening, past shrines where old women lit incense and prayed for the war to end. The Mitsubishi shipyard was massive, sprawling along the river with enormous dry docks, towering cranes, and half-built ships rising like steel skeletons against the sky. Yamaguchi spent his days in the design office, hunched over blueprints, calculating measurements, solving complex engineering problems. He worked alongside a team of other engineers, serious men who spoke little and worked much. One of them, Iwanaga, became something of a friend. They would eat lunch together, sitting on the dock, watching the river flow, talking about their families back home. "My daughter's birthday is in August," Iwanaga said one day. "I hope to be home by then." "You will be," Yamaguchi assured him. "The work is almost done." The assignment was meant to last 3 months, but the pace was grueling. They worked 6 days a week, often 12 hours a day. In the evenings, Yamaguchi would return to his room exhausted. He would eat whatever Mrs. Tanaka had prepared, usually thin soup and rice, then write letters to Hisako by candlelight. "My dearest wife," he wrote in late July, "the work here is nearly complete. Another week, perhaps 2, and I will return home. How is our boy? Does he ask for his father? Tell him I think of him every moment. Tell him I will return soon and never leave again." He mailed these letters and waited eagerly for Hisako's responses, which came once a week. Her letters were full of small details. Katsutoshi had said his first word. It was mama, which made Yamaguchi both proud and a little jealous. The cherry tree in their garden had bloomed beautifully. She missed him terribly. These letters were his lifeline. They reminded him why he worked, why he endured. By August 5th, his assignment was finally complete. The designs were finished. The calculations were checked and double-checked. The plans were approved by the project supervisor. He was free to go home. He purchased a train ticket for the afternoon of August 6th. He packed his suitcase. He said goodbye to Iwanaga and the other engineers. "See you back in Nagasaki," Iwanaga said, shaking his hand. "Safe travels, my friend," Yamaguchi replied. That evening, he wrote one final letter to Hisako. "Tomorrow I come home. Have the boy ready to greet his father. I cannot wait to hold you both again." He fell asleep that night smiling, thinking of home. He had no idea that tomorrow morning, at exactly 8:15 a.m., Hiroshima would cease to exist, and he would be standing at ground zero when it happened. Everything was ready for his departure, except fate had other plans. August the 6th, 1945. The morning arrived warm and cloudless, the kind of perfect summer morning that makes you grateful to be alive. Yamaguchi woke at 6:30 a.m., as he had every day for 3 months. But this morning was different. This morning he would go home. He performed his usual routine, washed his face in cold water from the basin, shaved carefully, dressed in his work clothes one last time. Mrs. Tanaka prepared a simple breakfast: rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables. She seemed sad to see him go. "You've been a good tenant, Yamaguchi-san," she said, bowing. "Your wife is lucky to have such a devoted husband." "Thank you for your kindness," he replied, returning the bow. He left the boarding house at 7 a.m., carrying his packed suitcase. His train wasn't until 2 p.m., but he wanted to do one final inspection of the shipyard, a last check to ensure everything was in order. It was his nature, thorough, meticulous, a man who finished what he started. Outside, the city was waking up. Cicadas sang in the trees, that distinctive summer sound that every Japanese child grows up hearing. Trams clanged along their tracks, packed with workers heading to factories. Mothers walked their children to school, holding their hands, reminding them to be good, to study hard. Soldiers marched in formation down the main streets, their boots echoing on the pavement. Shopkeepers opened their stores, sweeping the sidewalks, arranging their meager goods everywhere. The mundane, beautiful rhythm of ordinary life. No one knew that in the sky above them, history was already in motion. At 7 a.m., an air raid siren suddenly wailed across the city, that rising and falling cry that had become so familiar during the war. People looked up nervously. American B-29 bombers had been spotted approaching from the south. Yamaguchi, walking toward the shipyard, felt his stomach tighten. Not today, he thought. Please, not today. He survived 3 months in Hiroshima. Just a few more hours and he'd be on that train home. He ducked into a shelter, a reinforced concrete building where dozens of others had gathered, waiting. They stood in silence, listening to the drone of aircraft engines high above. But after 20 minutes, the all-clear sounded. The planes had passed. "Just a reconnaissance flight," the radio said. People emerged from the shelters, relieved, laughing nervously. "False alarm," someone joked. Life resumed. Yamaguchi continued toward the shipyard, his suitcase growing heavy in his hand. He reached the Mitsubishi facility around 8 a.m. The massive complex sprawled along the river, dry docks, warehouses, administrative buildings, towering cranes silhouetted against the morning sky. Ships in various stages of construction sat in the docks like sleeping giants. He walked through the yard, nodding to workers he'd come to know over the months. He made his way to the design office to sign out and collect his final payment. But when he reached the office, he realized he'd forgotten something. His personal seal, his hunko, the carved stamp. Used to sign official documents in Japan. He'd left it in his locker at the workers' dormitory. On the other side of the shipyard, he checked his watch. 8:10 a.m. He had time. He turned and walked back across the yard, heading toward the dormitory. This decision, this mundane, forgettable decision to retrieve a forgotten seal, would save his life. If he had been in the office, inside the building, the collapse would have killed him instantly. But instead, he was walking across an open field. At 8:14 a.m., he heard it, a sound, faint at first, then growing, the deep, droning hum of engines, high above. Very high, higher than any plane he'd ever heard. He looked up, shielding his eyes from the bright morning sun, and there, cutting through the perfect blue sky at 31,000 feet, he saw it, a single American B-29 bomber, flying higher than any Japanese fighter could reach, the Enola Gay, named after the pilot's mother, carrying a bomb unlike any bomb in history. The plane flew alone. No escorts, no formation. Strange, Yamaguchi thought. American bombers always traveled in groups for protection. Why is this one alone? He watched, curious, as the bomber traced a slow, graceful arc over the city, and then the bomb bay doors opened. A small object tumbled out, dark against the blue sky, spinning slowly as it fell. It had fins, like a large artillery shell. For a moment, just one frozen moment, Yamaguchi simply stared, trying to understand what he was seeing. And then, flash. A light brighter than 1,000 suns exploded across the sky. For an instant, just one terrible, eternal instant, everything turned white, pure, blinding, absolute. The light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It erased shadows. It erased colors. It erased the world itself. Yamaguchi felt a wave of heat, intense, searing heat that burned through his clothes, his skin, his very bones. He tried to scream but couldn't hear his own voice. And then the shockwave hit. An invisible hand picked him up and hurled him backward through the air like a ragdoll. He flew 10 feet and slammed into the ground, the impact driving the air from his lungs. The world became sound and fury, a roar like the earth itself splitting open. The ground heaved beneath him. His eardrums ruptured with a sharp, stabbing pain. And then silence. Not the silence of peace. The silence of death. The silence of a world that had ended. When Yamaguchi opened his eyes, he thought he had gone blind. Everything was white, a ghostly, ash-filled white that seemed to have no source and no end. He tried to move. Every part of his body screamed with pain. His left arm burned. The skin blackened, blistering, hanging in strips like paper. His face seared. He could feel it swelling, tightening, his hair singed, the smell of burned hair filling his nostrils. He touched his ears. Blood poured from them, warm and sticky. He tried to stand. His legs buckled, but he forced himself up. Around him, shapes moved through the smoke. Human figures, stumbling, falling, calling out in voices he couldn't hear. His hearing was gone, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that filled his head like a scream. The world was muffled, distant, as if he were underwater. Slowly, his vision began to clear, and what he saw made him forget the pain, made him forget everything. Hiroshima was gone. The buildings, the hundreds of wooden houses and shops that had filled the streets just minutes ago had been flattened, crushed, splintered, erased in their place. Nothing but rubble and fire. The Mitsubishi shipyard where he'd worked for 3 months, obliterated. The cranes had toppled like children's toys. The ships in the dry docks had been tossed aside like leaves. The boarding house where he'd slept, a pile of burning beams. The administrative building where he'd planned to collect his final payment collapsed into dust. Everything was gone. The sky had turned black. Smoke rose in massive columns, blotting out the sun, turning day into night, and in that smoke, Yamaguchi saw them. People, walking through the ruins like ghosts, but they didn't look like people anymore. Their clothes had been burned away, leaving them naked and bleeding. Their skin hung from their arms in sheets, dripping like melted wax. Their hair stood on end, singed and wild. Many had no faces and just raw, bleeding flesh where their features had been. Their eyes were gone, burned away, leaving empty sockets. They wandered aimlessly, arms outstretched like sleepwalkers, calling for water, calling for help, calling for their mothers. Some simply sat down in the rubble and waited to die. Children screamed for parents who would never answer. Mothers screamed for children they would never find. And everywhere, the smell of burning. Flesh, sweet, sickening, unforgettable, a smell that would haunt Yamaguchi for the rest of his life. He staggered forward, his mind struggling to comprehend what had happened. What was that? His brain kept asking, what weapon could do this? One bomb, he thought. One bomb did this? It was impossible. It defied logic, reason, everything he knew about physics and engineering. But it was real. He stumbled through the wreckage, searching desperately for water, for shelter, for any sign of life that hadn't been reduced to horror. His throat burned. His skin screamed with pain. His lungs filled with smoke and ash. He couldn't breathe without coughing. Each cough brought blood. Ahead, through the smoke, he saw a small irrigation ditch, a concrete channel that carried water to the rice fields. He stumbled toward it and fell in. The water hissed against his burns, steam rising from his body. The pain was excruciating, but the water felt like salvation. He drank desperately, not caring that it was filthy, contaminated with ash and debris and things he didn't want to think about. He lay there in the ditch for what felt like hours, drifting in and out of consciousness. Around him, the city continued to burn. The firestorm consumed everything: wood, paper, flesh. The heat was so intense that the rivers began to boil. Bodies floated downstream, hundreds of them. Thousands, bloated and blackened, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and agony. The Otter River, which had been so beautiful just that morning, had become a river of death. Through the smoke and haze, Yamaguchi heard a voice, weak, hoarse, barely human. "Yamaguchi, Yamaguchi-san," he turned. Blinking through the tears and blood, a figure emerged from the smoke, Iwanaga, his friend. The engineer he'd worked beside for 3 months, the man who'd talked about going home for his daughters. Birthday Iwanaga was burned worse than Yamaguchi. His entire body was raw and bleeding, but he was alive. "You survived," Iwanaga whispered. His voice broken, Yamaguchi nodded, unable to speak. Together, they helped each other out of the ditch. They stumbled through the ruins until they found a partially collapsed building that offered some shelter, a concrete structure, one of the few things still standing. They huddled inside as night fell, leaning against the cold walls, too shocked to speak, too traumatized to process what they'd seen. Yamaguchi thought of Hisako, of little Katsutoshi, of the letter he'd written last night. "Tomorrow I come home." He pulled the photograph from his pocket. Miraculously, it had survived, Hisako's face smiling, holding their son. He pressed the photograph to his chest and wept. "I will survive," he whispered to the darkness. "I will get home. I will see them again." He didn't know it yet. But that bomb, codenamed Little Boy, had killed at least 70,000 people instantly. By the end of the year, radiation sickness would claim another 70,000. The temperature at the hypocenter had reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to vaporize human beings, leaving only their shadows burned into concrete walls. The blast had destroyed 5 square miles of the city. Over 90% of Hiroshima's buildings were damaged or destroyed, and Tsutomu Yamaguchi was one of only a few dozen people who had been within a mile of the hypocenter and survived. But survival was only the beginning of his nightmare, because now he had to find a way home, to Nagasaki. He didn't know, couldn't possibly know, that in 3 days, the second atomic bomb would follow him there. The next morning, August 7th, Yamaguchi woke to a world transformed into hell. The fires had burned through the night, and now Hiroshima lay under a pall of smoke so thick that the sun appeared as nothing more than a dim red circle in the sky, like a dying ember. His body had stiffened overnight. His burns had worsened. The skin on his left arm was raw, weeping plasma and blood. His face felt tight and swollen, barely recognizable. Every movement brought fresh agony, but he was alive, and he had to keep moving. Beside him, Iwanaga stirred. His friend looked worse than he had the night before. The burns covered most of his body. His breathing was shallow, labored. "We have to find the train station," Yamaguchi said, his voice hoarse. "We have to get home," Iwanaga nodded weakly. "My daughter, her birthday." Together they struggled to their feet and stumbled, out of the ruined building and back into the nightmare. The scene in daylight was even more horrific than it had been during the chaos of the blast. Bodies lay everywhere, on the streets, in the river, piled against walls where the blast had thrown them. Some were burned beyond recognition, reduced to charred husks. Others looked almost peaceful, as if they had simply lain down to sleep and never woken up. These were the victims of radiation, though no one understood what that meant yet. They had seemed uninjured after the blast, but within hours, they had simply died. Rescue workers moved through the rubble, their faces wrapped in cloth to block the smell, trying to find survivors. But there were so few. Military trucks rolled through the streets, collecting bodies, stacking them like firewood. Soldiers dug mass graves on the outskirts of the city. The city's hospitals had been destroyed or were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses worked with almost no supplies, no bandages, no medicine, no anesthetic. They could do little but watch people die. Yamaguchi and Iwanaga began the long walk toward what had been the train station. They moved slowly, painfully, stopping every few minutes to rest. Other survivors joined them, a silent procession of the wounded, all heading toward the same desperate hope that somehow a train was still running. As they walked, Yamaguchi saw things that would haunt him forever. A mother kneeling beside her daughter's body, combing the girl's hair, speaking softly as if the child might wake up. A man sitting in the ruins of his house, holding a family photograph, staring at it with empty eyes. A group of school children, no more than 10 years old, lined up in a perfect row against a wall, all dead, their bodies unmarked, killed by the shockwave's pressure alone. A woman wandering the streets, calling her husband's name over and over, even though everyone around her was a stranger or a corpse. The shadows burned into walls, permanent imprints of people who had been vaporized in the instant of the blast. A man sitting on steps, a woman with a baby, a child playing with a ball, gone in a flash, but their shadows remained, proof that they had existed, that they had lived, that they had been real. Yamaguchi walked past these shadows and felt something break inside him. The walk took hours. The streets were unrecognizable. Every landmark had vanished. The city had become a uniform landscape of rubble and ash. Several times they got lost and had to backtrack, wasting precious energy. The August heat was merciless. There was no shade, no water. Yamaguchi's lips cracked and bled. His tongue swelled. His vision blurred, but still he walked. Around midday, they finally reached what had been Hiroshima's main train station. Yamaguchi's heart sank. The grand building, a beautiful structure that had been one of the city's architectural landmarks, was destroyed. The platforms were rubble. The tracks were twisted like ribbons, curled up from the heat. "It's over," Iwanaga whispered. "There's no way out." But then Yamaguchi heard it, faint but unmistakable, the whistle of a locomotive. He turned, scanning the ruins, and there, impossibly, miraculously, a train, a single battered carriage, sitting on a section of track that had somehow survived. Steam rose from its engine. It was damaged, covered in ash, but it was working, and it was packed with survivors. People hung from the windows. They sat on the roof. They clung to the sides, all desperate to escape, to get away from this city of death. The train. Yamaguchi grabbed Iwanaga's arm. "Come on." They ran, or tried to. Their bodies barely cooperated, but adrenaline pushed them forward. They reached the train just as it began to move. Hands reached down from the windows. Pulling them aboard, they collapsed into the crowd, pressed so tightly against other bodies that there was no room to sit, no room to breathe. The car was filled with the wounded, men, women, children, all burned, all bleeding, all silent with shock. There were no seats, no space. People stood pressed against each other in a mass of suffering humanity. Many were too badly injured to stand and simply sat on the floor, leaning against each other for support. The smell was overwhelming. Burned flesh, blood, sweat, smoke, death. Some people cried quietly. Others stared at nothing, their minds broken. A few prayed, whispering sutras or Christian prayers, depending on their faith. But most were simply silent. What was there to say? The train lurched forward, creaking and groaning. It moved slowly, barely walking speed, along the damaged tracks. As it pulled away from Hiroshima, Yamaguchi pressed his face to the window and looked back. Smoke rose from the ruins, climbing miles into the sky, forming a massive mushroom cloud that could be seen for 100 miles. The city where he had worked, where he had walked and laughed and lived for 3 months, was gone. 350,000 people had lived there yesterday morning. By tonight, most of them would be dead, and he was one of the lucky ones. He closed his eyes, but the images remained. The flash, the light, the shadows, the bodies, the screams he would never forget. The journey home took nearly 20 hours. The train moved at a crawl, stopping frequently to avoid damaged sections of track or to let military trains pass. There was no food. No water. No medical care. People died standing up, their bodies held upright by the press of the crowd. When the train stopped, the dead were removed and left by the tracks. No ceremony. No prayers. No dignity. There was no time. Yamaguchi drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind floating between reality and nightmare. He dreamed of the flash, that terrible white light that had swallowed the world. He dreamed of his son's face, smiling up at him. He dreamed of Hisako's voice, singing softly while she cooked dinner. He dreamed of home. Each time he woke, the nightmare was still there, the crowded train car, the smell, the pain. Beside him, Iwanaga grew weaker with each passing hour. His breathing became shallow. His skin turned gray. "Stay with me," Yamaguchi whispered, though he could barely hear his own voice through the ringing in his ears. "We're almost home." But Iwanaga's eyes were distant, unfocused. "Tell my daughter," he whispered, "that I tried to come home." "You'll tell her yourself," Yamaguchi said. "Just hold on." But deep down, he knew his friend was dying. The train rolled through the night, through the darkness of a Japan that would never be the same. They passed through towns and villages that seemed frozen in time, places where the war felt distant, where children still played in the streets and life continued its ordinary rhythm. People at stations stared at the train as it passed, at the wounded passengers visible through the windows, their faces masks of horror and pity. Some brought water and rice balls, passing them up to the windows, but there was never enough. When the train finally pulled into Nagasaki late on August 7th, Yamaguchi could barely stand. His legs shook. His vision swam. His entire body felt like it was on fire, but he was home. He helped Iwanaga off the train, supporting his weight. But his friend could barely walk. "I'll get you to a hospital," Yamaguchi promised. "No," Iwanaga said weakly. "My family. Take me to my family," Yamaguchi nodded. He understood. If these were Iwanaga's last hours, he should spend them at home. They parted at the station. Two men who had survived the impossible together. Yamaguchi watched as Iwanaga's brother-in-law arrived to take him home, half carrying him away into the night. He never saw Iwanaga again. His friend died 2 days later from his burns, never making it to his daughter's birthday. But now, alone in the familiar streets of Nagasaki, Yamaguchi felt something almost impossible to believe. Hope. Here everything was normal. People walked calmly. Shops were open. Street lamps glowed. Children laughed in their yards. It was as if the apocalypse that had consumed Hiroshima had never happened. For a moment, standing on that platform, Yamaguchi wondered if he had imagined it all, if the horror had been some terrible fever dream. But then he looked down at his bandaged arm, felt the searing pain burning through his body, smelled the smoke that clung to his clothes, and knew it was real. Every step toward home was agony. He stumbled through the narrow lanes of his neighborhood, past houses he'd known his whole life, past the shrine where he'd prayed as a boy, past the tree where he and Hisako had first held hands. Everything was the same, but he was not. When he finally reached his house and knocked on the door, his hand trembling, he heard footsteps inside. The door slid open. Hisako stood there, and for a moment, she didn't recognize him. His face was swollen and burned almost beyond recognition. His clothes were torn and bloodied and reeked of smoke and death. He looked like a ghost. "Tsutomu?" she whispered, her voice breaking. He nodded, unable to speak, and then he collapsed into her arms. Hisako helped him inside, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. She laid him on the futon and began carefully, gently unwrapping his makeshift bandages. When she saw his wounds, the raw, blistered skin, the deep burns that went down to the muscle, she gasped and covered her mouth. "What happened?" she whispered. "What did this do to you?" Their son, Katsutoshi, now 10 months old, toddled over, curious. When he saw his father, he didn't recognize him and began to cry. The sound broke Yamaguchi's heart. "It's me," he whispered, reaching out with his unbandaged hand. "It's Papa," but the boy turned away, frightened, clinging to his mother. That night, after Hisako had cleaned his wounds as best she could with the meager medical supplies they had, after she had given him water and a little rice porridge, he told her everything. He told her about the American bomber flying alone, about the small object falling from the sky, about the flash, that terrible, blinding flash that had turned the world white, about the city disappearing in an instant, about the people with no faces, wandering through the fire, about the shadows burned into walls, about the river of bodies. He told her everything, and with each word her face grew paler. "How?" she whispered. "How is such a thing possible?" Yamaguchi shook his head. "I don't know. But it happened. I saw it. One bomb, Hisako. One bomb destroyed the entire city." She looked at him, searching his eyes to see if the trauma had broken his mind. But she saw only the truth there, and terror. "You're safe now," she said, taking his hand carefully, avoiding the burns. "You're home. That horror, it's over." He nodded, wanting to believe it. "We must be grateful," he said. "We're together. We're alive. Nagasaki is safe." That night he lay on the futon, his body burning with pain, but his heart at peace. His wife was beside him. His son was asleep in the next room. He was home. He had survived the impossible. The worst was behind him, or so he believed. August 8th passed quietly. Yamaguchi was too weak to leave the futon. His wounds throbbed. His fever rose and fell. Hisako tended to him constantly, changing his bandages, bringing him water and weak tea, trying to get him to eat. She had heard reports on the radio about Hiroshima. The government said it had been attacked with a new type of bomb, but gave few details. The full horror was being censored. Most Japanese citizens had no idea what had really happened. Neighbors came by to visit. Having heard that Yamaguchi had returned from Hiroshima, they asked questions. He tried to answer. But how do you explain the end of the world to people who have never seen it? "It was terrible," he said simply. "Worse than anything you can imagine." They nodded sympathetically but didn't really understand. How could they? That evening, Hisako sat beside him as the sun set. "You need to rest," she said. "Let your body heal." "I should report to work tomorrow," he said. "You can barely stand," she protested. "I must," he said quietly. "I must tell them what I saw. They need to know. The whole company needs to know," she wanted to argue. But she knew her husband. Duty was everything to him. On the morning of August 9th, despite Hisako's protests, Yamaguchi insisted on going to the Mitsubishi offices. He could barely walk. But he dressed slowly, painfully, and prepared to leave. "Please," Hisako begged. "One more day. Just rest one more day. I'll be back by afternoon," he promised, kissing her forehead. "I just need to report what happened. Then I'll rest." She watched him go, that same heavy feeling in her chest that she'd felt when he'd left for Hiroshima. But she pushed it away. What could happen? He was home now. In Nagasaki, safe she decided to go to the market later that morning to buy fresh bandages for his wounds. Maybe some vegetables. If she could find any, she wanted to make him a proper meal tonight. This simple decision, this mundane plan to buy bandages, would save her life. Yamaguchi walked slowly through the familiar streets toward the Mitsubishi shipyard, offices in the Sumiyoshi district. The walk that usually took 20 minutes took him almost an hour. Every step sent pain shooting through his body. People stared at him as he passed, a man covered in bandages, moving like someone twice his age. But he kept walking. He had to tell them. He had to make them understand. When he arrived at the office around 9 a.m., his co-workers were shocked. The room fell silent as he entered. "Yamaguchi-san," one of them gasped. "My God, what happened to you?" He was covered in bandages. His face was burned and swollen. He looked like he'd been through war itself, which, in a way, he had. They gathered around him, their faces full of concern and curiosity. "Sit down," his supervisor Sato said. "Please sit." Yamaguchi lowered himself into a chair, wincing. And then he told them. He told them everything. About Hiroshima. About the American bomber. About the single bomb that had destroyed an entire city in seconds. His colleagues listened, their expressions shifting from concern to disbelief. A single bomb? One engineer asked skeptically. Yes, Yamaguchi said, his voice firm despite his exhaustion. I was there, I saw it. The whole city, gone in an instant. But that's impossible, another said. No bomb could do that. The flash, Yamaguchi continued, his hands trembling as he spoke. It was brighter than the sun. And then the shockwave, it threw me through the air like I weighed nothing. The room was silent for a moment. Then Sato, his supervisor, frowned. Yamaguchi, he said slowly, carefully. You've been through something terrible. No one doubts that. But surely you're mistaken about the details. Perhaps it was many bombs. Perhaps in your trauma, your memory, I know what I saw. Yamaguchi's voice cracked with frustration and pain. He had walked through hell. He had barely survived. He had dragged himself home and forced himself back to work despite his injuries, and they didn't believe him. I'm not crazy, he said quietly. I'm telling you the truth. One bomb destroyed Hiroshima, and if they have one, they might have more. We need to prepare. We need to— Yamaguchi, Sato interrupted gently. You're in shock. You need medical attention. Perhaps you should go home and— I was there! Yamaguchi shouted, standing up, his body shaking. I saw it! The city of 350,000 people gone in seconds. And you're telling me I'm— And then, the windows exploded with light. That same terrible, blinding white light. The light that Yamaguchi had seen 3 days ago in Hiroshima. The light he had prayed he would never see again. Time seemed to stop. For one frozen instant, Yamaguchi stood there, his mind refusing to accept what was happening. No, this can't be. Not again. This can't be happening again. His legs gave out. He fell to the floor, his body moving on instinct, curling into a protective ball. Around him, his colleagues stood frozen, staring at the brilliant light filling the windows. Too shocked to move, and then the shockwave hit. Boom! The building convulsed like a living thing. Windows shattered. Glass exploding inward in a deadly shower. The walls cracked. The ceiling groaned. Dust and debris rained down. Papers flew through the air like snow. Desks overturned. Equipment crashed to the floor. People screamed. The roar was deafening. That same terrible roar Yamaguchi had heard 3 days ago. The sound of the world. Ending. The building shook for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. When it stopped, the office was in ruins. Walls had partially collapsed. Smoke poured in through broken windows. Sparks flew from severed electrical wires. Around him, Yamaguchi's co-workers were picking themselves up. Bleeding, dazed, terrified. Sato, the supervisor who had doubted him moments ago, was sitting on the floor, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror. He looked at Yamaguchi. You were right, he whispered. My God, you were right. Yamaguchi struggled to his feet. His burns had reopened. Fresh blood soaked through his bandages. But he was alive. Again. Twice. He had survived 2 atomic bombs. The impossibility of it didn't register yet. There was no time to process it. He stumbled to the window and looked out, and his entire world stopped. Nagasaki was on fire, a massive mushroom cloud, dark, monstrous, impossibly tall, rose into the sky, climbing higher and higher until it seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. The Urakami Valley, just a mile north of where he stood, had been obliterated. The Mitsubishi Steelworks, the Mitsubishi Arms Plant, the Urakami Cathedral, the largest Christian church in Asia, all gone. Buildings were flattened in every direction. Fires raged across the city. The bomb, called Fat Man, had detonated 650 feet above the ground with the force of 21,000 tons of TNT. It was even more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The city of Nagasaki, Yamaguchi's home, his birthplace, his sanctuary, had just been erased. At least 70,000. People died instantly or in the hours that followed. And Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man who had survived Hiroshima 3 days earlier, had just survived a second atomic bomb. 2 cities, 2 bombs, 2 apocalypses, 1 impossible survivor. But in that moment, Yamaguchi didn't think about the impossibility. He didn't think about how unlikely it was, how statistically impossible. He thought only of his family. Hisako Katsutoshi, his wife and son were out there. Somewhere in the burning city, terror seized him. Cold. Absolute terror. "I have to go," he said to no one in particular. He ran from the office, his body screaming in protest, and plunged into the nightmare again. The streets of Nagasaki had become hell on earth. It was Hiroshima all over again, the same smoke, the same fire, the same horror. But this time, it was his home burning. Yamaguchi ran through streets he'd known his entire life, now unrecognizable. Buildings burned on both sides. Power lines dangled sparking from broken poles. Bodies lay everywhere, some moving, most not. The heat was unbearable. The air itself seemed to be on fire. His lungs burned with each breath. His wounds bled freely, but he didn't care. None of it mattered. Only finding them mattered. "Hisako!" he screamed, his voice hoarse and broken. "Katsutoshi!" The sound was barely audible over the roar of the flames. He ran toward his neighborhood, his feet pounding on rubble and ash. As he ran, he passed scenes that were horrifyingly familiar from Hiroshima, a mother cradling a dead child, rocking back and forth, humming a lullaby. A man stumbling through the streets, his skin hanging in sheets, his eyes gone. A group of schoolchildren lying in a perfect row, their bodies unmarked, killed by the shockwave. A woman sitting in the ruins of her house, staring at her hands, which were burned black. The rivers, his beautiful rivers that had sparkled in the sunlight, now glowed red with blood. Bodies floated downstream like logs. The same nightmare. The same horror. But 1,000 times worse because this was home. These weren't strangers dying. These were his neighbors, people he'd known his whole life. The shopkeeper who used to give him candies as a boy. The old man who sat by the shrine every morning, feeding the birds. The young couple who lived next door, always laughing, always happy, all gone. Yamaguchi's mind couldn't process it all. The horror was too vast, too complete. So he focused on one thing, finding his family. He ran faster, ignoring the pain, ignoring the burning in his lungs, ignoring everything except the need to reach them. His street came into view. Half the houses had collapsed. The others were burning, but his house was still standing. Damaged, yes. The roof had caved in on one side. The walls were cracked, windows shattered, but standing. "Hisako!" he shouted, stumbling through the door. "Katsutoshi!" Silence. The house was empty. No one was inside. Panic seized him. Cold, absolute. Crushing panic. No, please God, no, not them. Not them too. He ran back outside, looking frantically up and down the street. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. "Hisako!" He screamed into the smoke and fire. "Where are you?" And then he heard it, faint, distant, a baby's cry, his baby's cry. He would know that sound anywhere, the sound he'd heard in the middle of the night when Katsutoshi was hungry, the sound that made his heart swell with love and responsibility. He spun around, trying to locate the source. And there, emerging from the smoke at the end of the street like ghosts materializing from another world, he saw them. Hisako, clutching their son in her arms, her clothes torn, her face smudged with ash. "But alive, alive, Tsutomu!" she cried, her voice breaking. He ran to them and pulled them both into his arms, holding them so tightly he thought he might break them. "You're alive," he sobbed, his whole body shaking. "You're alive! You're alive!" He said it over and over, unable to believe it, unable to accept that in this nightmare, this one miracle had occurred. Hisako was trembling violently. "I was at the market," she said, her voice shaking. "Getting bandages for you." When the flash came, I was near the tunnel by the old shrine. I ran inside. The tunnel. It saved us. It saved us. The tunnel, a simple pedestrian tunnel, built decades ago to connect two parts of the city. It had shielded them from the blast. Pure chance. Pure luck, or perhaps something more. Perhaps fate had decided that this family, this one family among hundreds of thousands, would survive. Both bombs, both cities. Together. Katsutoshi, confused and terrified and crying, clung to his mother. When he saw his father, he reached out his small hands. "Papa," he whimpered. The word broke something inside Yamaguchi. He took his son in his arms, kissing his forehead, his cheeks, his hands, tears streaming down his burned face. "My boy," he whispered. "My precious boy." They stood there in the burning street, the three of them holding each other. As Nagasaki collapsed around them, the world was ending again. But they had each other. And in that moment, that was everything. Yamaguchi looked up at the mushroom cloud still climbing into the sky, darkening the heavens, and he made a silent vow. "I have survived the impossible, twice. I have walked through 2 nuclear fires and lived. This cannot be random. This cannot be chance. There must be a reason. If I live, if we live, I will tell the world what I've seen. I will make sure no one forgets. I will make sure this never, ever happens again." The man who had survived both atomic bombs had found his purpose. That same terrible, blinding white light. The light that Yamaguchi had seen 3 days ago in Hiroshima. The light he had prayed he would never see again. Time seemed to stop. For one frozen instant, Yamaguchi stood there, his mind refusing to accept what was happening. No, this can't be. Not again. This can't be happening again. His legs gave out. He fell to the floor, his body moving on instinct, curling into a protective ball. Around him, his colleagues stood frozen, staring at the brilliant light filling the windows. Too shocked to move, and then the shockwave hit. Boom! The building convulsed like a living thing. Windows shattered. Glass exploding inward in a deadly shower. The walls cracked. The ceiling groaned. Dust and debris rained down. Papers flew through the air like snow. Desks overturned. Equipment crashed to the floor. People screamed. The roar was deafening. That same terrible roar Yamaguchi had heard 3 days ago. The sound of the world. Ending. The building shook for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. When it stopped, the office was in ruins. Walls had partially collapsed. Smoke poured in through broken windows. Sparks flew from severed electrical wires. Around him, Yamaguchi's co-workers were picking themselves up. Bleeding, dazed, terrified. Sato, the supervisor who had doubted him moments ago, was sitting on the floor, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror. He looked at Yamaguchi. "You were right," he whispered. "My God, you were right." Yamaguchi struggled to his feet. His burns had reopened. Fresh blood soaked through his bandages. But he was alive. Again. Twice. He had survived 2 atomic bombs. The impossibility of it didn't register yet. There was no time to process it. He stumbled to the window and looked out, and his entire world stopped. Nagasaki was on fire, a massive mushroom cloud, dark, monstrous, impossibly tall, rose into the sky, climbing higher and higher until it seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. The Urakami Valley, just a mile north of where he stood, had been obliterated. The Mitsubishi Steelworks, the Mitsubishi Arms Plant, the Urakami Cathedral, the largest Christian church in Asia, all gone. Buildings were flattened in every direction. Fires raged across the city. The bomb, called Fat Man, had detonated 650 feet above the ground with the force of 21,000 tons of TNT. It was even more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The city of Nagasaki, Yamaguchi's home, his birthplace, his sanctuary, had just been erased. At least 70,000. People died instantly or in the hours that followed. And Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man who had survived Hiroshima 3 days earlier, had just survived a second atomic bomb. 2 cities, 2 bombs, 2 apocalypses, 1 impossible survivor. But in that moment, Yamaguchi didn't think about the impossibility. He didn't think about how unlikely it was, how statistically impossible. He thought only of his family. Hisako Katsutoshi, his wife and son were out there, somewhere in the burning city. Terror seized him, cold, absolute terror. "I have to go," he said to no one in particular. He ran from the office, his body screaming in protest. and plunged into the nightmare again. The streets of Nagasaki had become hell on earth. It was Hiroshima all over again, the same smoke, the same fire, the same horror. But this time, it was his home burning. Yamaguchi ran through streets he'd known his entire life, now unrecognizable. Buildings burned on both sides. Power lines dangled sparking from broken poles. Bodies lay everywhere, some moving, most not. The heat was unbearable. The air itself seemed to be on fire. His lungs burned with each breath. His wounds bled freely, but he didn't care. None of it mattered. Only finding them mattered. "Hisako!" he screamed, his voice hoarse and broken. "Katsutoshi!" The sound was barely audible over the roar of the flames. He ran toward his neighborhood, his feet pounding on rubble and ash. As he ran, he passed scenes that were horrifyingly familiar from Hiroshima, a mother cradling a dead child, rocking back and forth, humming a lullaby. A man stumbling through the streets, his skin hanging in sheets, his eyes gone. A group of schoolchildren lying in a perfect row, their bodies unmarked, killed by the shockwave. A woman sitting in the ruins of her house, staring at her hands, which were burned black. The rivers, his beautiful rivers that had sparkled in the sunlight, now glowed red with blood. Bodies floated downstream like logs. The same nightmare. The same horror, but 1,000 times worse because this was home. These weren't strangers dying. These were his neighbors, people he'd known his whole life. The shopkeeper who used to give him candies as a boy, the old man who sat by the shrine every morning, feeding the birds, the young couple who lived next door, always laughing, always happy, all gone. Yamaguchi's mind couldn't process it all. The horror was too vast, too complete. So he focused on one thing, finding his family. He ran faster, ignoring the pain, ignoring the burning in his lungs, ignoring everything except the need to reach them. His street came into view. Half the houses had collapsed. The others were burning, but his house was still standing. Damaged, yes. The roof had caved in on one side. The walls were cracked, windows shattered, but standing. "Hisako!" he shouted, stumbling through the door. "Katsutoshi!" Silence. The house was empty. No one was inside. Panic seized him. Cold, absolute. Crushing panic. No, please God, no, not them. Not them too. He ran back outside, looking frantically up and down the street. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. "Hisako!" he screamed into the smoke and fire. "Where are you?" And then he heard it, faint, distant, a baby's cry, his baby's cry. He would know that sound anywhere, the sound he'd heard in the middle of the night when Katsutoshi was hungry, the sound that made his heart swell with love and responsibility. He spun around, trying to locate the source. And there, emerging from the smoke at the end of the street like ghosts materializing from another world, he saw them. Hisako, clutching their son in her arms, her clothes torn, her face smudged with ash. "But alive, alive, Tsutomu!" she cried, her voice breaking. He ran to them and pulled them both into his arms, holding them so tightly he thought he might break them. "You're alive," he sobbed, his whole body shaking. "You're alive! You're alive!" He said it over and over, unable to believe it, unable to accept that in this nightmare, this one miracle had occurred. Hisako was trembling violently. "I was at the market," she said, her voice shaking. "Getting bandages for you." When the flash came, I was near the tunnel by the old shrine. I ran inside. The tunnel. It saved us. It saved us. The tunnel, a simple pedestrian tunnel, built decades ago to connect two parts of the city. It had shielded them from the blast. Pure chance. Pure luck, or perhaps something more. Perhaps fate had decided that this family, this one family among hundreds of thousands, would survive. Both bombs. Both cities. Together. Katsutoshi, confused and terrified and crying, clung to his mother. When he saw his father, he reached out his small hands. "Papa," he whimpered. The word broke something inside Yamaguchi. He took his son in his arms, kissing his forehead, his cheeks, his hands. tears streaming down his burned face. "My boy," he whispered. "My precious boy." They stood there in the burning street, the three of them holding each other. As Nagasaki collapsed around them, the world was ending again. But they had each other. And in that moment, that was everything. Yamaguchi looked up at the mushroom cloud still climbing into the sky, darkening the heavens, and he made a silent vow. "I have survived the impossible, twice. I have walked through 2 nuclear fires and lived. This cannot be random. This cannot be chance. There must be a reason. If I live, if we live, I will tell the world what I've seen. I will make sure no one forgets. I will make sure this never, ever happens again." The man who had survived both atomic bombs had found his purpose. Tsutomu Yamaguchi lived quietly for many years after the war. He raised his son, Katsutoshi, who grew up healthy despite his parents' radiation exposure, a small miracle in itself. He worked diligently at Mitsubishi, eventually rising to a senior engineering position. He and Hisako had 2 daughters in the years after the war, proof that life could continue, that hope could survive even after the apocalypse. He grew old, his hair turning white, his body moving slower, but the memories never faded. The light, the heat, the screams, they were always there, just beneath the surface. For decades, he rarely spoke about what he had experienced. The Japanese government discouraged hibakusha from telling their stories. It was seen as unpatriotic, as dwelling on defeat, as making Japan look weak, and most survivors found it too painful to remember. Anyway, but in the 1980s, nearly 40 years after the bombs, something changed. The world was in the grip of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union had built nuclear arsenals capable of destroying the entire planet multiple times. Thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at cities around the world. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction meant that one mistake, one miscalculation, could end human civilization. And Yamaguchi realized that his silence was a form of complicity. He was one of the few people alive who had experienced nuclear war firsthand. He had walked through 2 atomic explosions and survived. If he didn't speak, if he didn't tell the world what nuclear weapons really meant, then who would? So, at the age of 70, he began to share his story. He started with local schools in Nagasaki. He would sit in classrooms filled with children the same age his son had been when the bombs fell, and tell them what he had seen. He didn't soften the truth. He told them about the flash that turned people to shadows, about the rivers choked with bodies, about the children screaming for parents who would never answer, about the slow, painful death from radiation. The students listened in stunned silence. Many cried. Some had nightmares afterward, but they never forgot. And that was the point. You must remember, Yamaguchi would tell them, because the people who lived through this are dying. Soon there will be no one left to tell you. And if you forget, it will happen again. He began giving interviews to journalists and historians. He wrote essays for peace organizations. He joined other hibakusha in campaigning for nuclear disarmament. In his 80s, he traveled to the United States, the country that had dropped the bombs, not with anger, but with a message of peace. He spoke at universities. He met with policymakers. "I don't blame the Americans," he said in one interview. "The people who dropped those bombs were just following orders, just like I was when I designed ships for the war. What I blame is the weapon itself, the idea that such destruction could ever be justified." In 2006, at the age of 90, he spoke at the United Nations headquarters in New York. His hands trembled as he gripped the podium. His voice was quiet but steady. "I have seen what nuclear weapons do," he said. "Not in theory, not in simulations. I have seen it with my own eyes. I have seen it twice. I have seen a city of 350,000 people disappear in seconds. Have seen children burned beyond recognition. I have seen mothers trying to find pieces of their families in the ashes. I have seen shadows burned into concrete where people once stood. And I am here to tell you, no one ever, anywhere, should see these things again. The light of those bombs never fades. It burns in the memory of those who saw it. And soon, we will all be gone, and the memory will fade too. That is what I fear most. Not dying, but that humanity will forget and make the same mistake again. Please, please, do not forget. The chamber was silent when he finished. Some delegates wept openly. In 2009, the Japanese government officially recognized him as the only person to have survived both atomic bombings. The only Niju Hibakusha, double survivor in history out of over 400,000 people who experienced the atomic bombings. He was the only one officially documented to have been in both cities when the bombs fell. The odds of surviving one atomic bomb at close range were slim. The odds of being in two cities when atomic bombs fell and surviving both were astronomical. Yet here he was, when journalists asked him how he felt about this recognition. He didn't celebrate. "I don't feel lucky," he said quietly. "I feel responsible. I survived for a reason, to tell the world what I saw, to make sure it never happens again." In his final years, even as his body weakened, he continued speaking. He gave over 200 talks at schools and universities. He appeared in numerous documentaries. He wrote a memoir titled "The Day the Sun Fell." "As long as I have breath," he said in one of his last interviews, "I will speak. Because I am carrying the voices of 200,000 people who can't speak anymore. I am their witness. I am their warning." Tsutomu Yamaguchi died on January 4th, 2010, at the age of 93 from stomach cancer. He passed away peacefully at his home in Nagasaki, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, the city he had returned to after Hiroshima, the city where the second bomb had found him, the city that became his home for the rest of his long, improbable life outside. Snow was falling gently on Nagasaki, the same snow that falls every winter, covering the scars, making everything clean and white and new. The man who had walked through two infernos had finally found rest. His funeral was attended by hundreds, students he had taught, peace activists he had inspired, survivors he had given voice to. The mayor of Nagasaki delivered a eulogy. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was not just a survivor, he said. He was a witness. He was a teacher. He was a voice for those who could no longer speak. He carried an unbearable burden with grace and dignity, and he used his pain to try to heal the world. At his grave, someone left a white flower, a symbol of peace in Japanese culture. Attached was a note, written in a child's handwriting. It read, "You saw the end of the world, so we could build a new beginning. Thank you for warning us. We will not forget." And perhaps that is the true meaning of Tsutomu Yamaguchi's life, not survival, but a witness, not luck, but purpose. He was proof that even in the darkest moment of human history, a single life could carry light. He was not a soldier. He was not a general. He was not a politician. He was just a man, an engineer, a father, a husband who witnessed the worst humanity could do and chose to dedicate the rest of his life to making sure it never happened again. He walked through two atomic bombs and somehow found the strength to turn that unimaginable suffering into a message of peace. He carried the scars of two cities on his body. He carried the voices of 200,000 dead in his heart. He carried a warning for all humanity in his words. "The reason that I hate nuclear weapons," he once said, "is because of what they do to ordinary people. Not soldiers, not generals, ordinary people. Children walking to school, mothers hanging laundry, old men feeding birds at shrines. People are just trying to live their lives. The bombs don't discriminate. They don't care if you're innocent. They just destroy everything. And the pain doesn't end when the explosion ends. It continues. In the burns, in the radiation, in the nightmares, in the grief that never fades. I survived twice, but part of me died in both cities. Part of me is still there, in the ruins, with the others who didn't make it. I speak for them now. I am their voice, and I will speak until I have no breath left." And he did. Until his very last days, he spoke, he warned, he pleaded, not with anger, not with hatred, but with love. Love for the children who deserve to grow up without fear. Love for the cities that deserve to stand. Love for humanity. Despite all its flaws, despite all its capacity for destruction. Tsutomu Yamaguchi lived through two atomic bombs. and he used his second chance, his improbable second chance, to teach the world peace. Today, Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been rebuilt. They are beautiful, modern cities full of life and hope. But in the heart of each city stands a memorial. In Hiroshima, the atomic bomb dome, one of the few buildings that survived the blast, stands as it was, frozen in time, a skeleton of twisted metal and concrete. In Nagasaki, a peace statue towers over the city, one hand pointing to the sky where the bomb fell, the other extended in a gesture of peace. And every year, on August 6th and August 9th, the cities hold memorial ceremonies. Bells ring. Doves are released. Thousands gather to remember. The names of the dead are read aloud, names that take hours to recite because there are so many. Survivors, now in their 90s, now so few, share their stories one more time, and children light lanterns and float them down the rivers, each light representing a soul lost, each flame a promise to remember. The hibakusha are dying now. Every year there are fewer of them. Soon, there will be none. And when the last survivor is gone, the world will have lost something irreplaceable, the living memory of what nuclear war really means. But Tsutomu Yamaguchi's voice remains. In books, in documentaries, in the thousands of students he spoke to, who now tell their own children, his warning echoes across the years. The light of those bombs never fades. It burns in the memory of those who saw it. Do not let the memory die. Because if you forget, it will happen again. Today, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons. There are approximately 13,000 nuclear warheads in the world, each one many times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Enough to end human civilization many times over. The threat that Yamaguchi warned against has not disappeared. If anything, it has grown, but so has the movement for peace that he helped inspire. Every year, more people visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They walk through the museums. They see the artifacts, a child's burned lunchbox, a watch stopped at 8:15, a shadow burned into stone. They read the stories, they see the photographs, and they understand, in a way that words alone cannot convey, what nuclear war means. Not strategy, not politics, not numbers, but real people, real suffering, real death. Tsutomu Yamaguchi's life stands as proof that one person can make a difference, that one voice can carry the weight of history, that even the darkest experience can be transformed into light. He survived the impossible, not once, but twice, and he used that impossible survival to give the world an impossible gift. A warning, a witness, a reminder. The light of 2 atomic bombs burned into his flesh, into his memory, into his soul. But he refused to let that light consume him. Instead, he turned it outward. He made it shine as a warning beacon to all humanity. This must never happen again. Never, never, never. That is the legacy of Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man who survived both atomic bombs. The witness who refused to be silenced, the voice that still speaks, even now, years after his death. Because some stories must never be forgotten, some warnings must never be ignored, and some lights, even the terrible light of atomic fire, can be transformed through courage and grace into something that guides rather than destroys. Tsutomu Yamaguchi saw the end of the world, and he came back to tell us how to save it. This has been the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man who survived both atomic bombs, a story of unimaginable suffering, of impossible survival, of courage and resilience and hope. If you believe stories like this must never be forgotten, if you believe that the past still has lessons to teach us about the future, if you believe that every life has meaning and every voice matters, then subscribe to Wardiere. Because history is not just dates and battles and treaties. History is people. People like Tsutomu Yamaguchi, who lived through the impossible and chose to turn his suffering into wisdom. People like the 200,000 souls who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whose stories deserve to be remembered. People like you and me, who have a responsibility to learn from the past so we don't repeat its worst mistakes. Every week, we bring you the untold stories of World War II, stories of courage and tragedy, of heroism and horror, of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Stories that remind us who we were, who we are, and who we can choose to be. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, because the only way to honor the dead is to remember them. The only way to prevent the horrors of the past is to never forget them. And the only way to build a better future is to understand where we've been. The past still speaks, and we are here to listen. This is Wardiere, Tales of War, Stories of Humanity. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering, and may we never see that terrible light again.